You know how some people just carry weight differently? Not the kind you see, the kind you feel when they walk into a room, the kind that makes conversations pause for half a second too long, the kind that sits in the air after they've already left. Minjun was that kind of heavy. Seoul at 2 a.m. is its own world. Neon signs reflecting off wet pavement, street vendors packing up tteokbokki carts, salarymen stumbling out of noraebang bars, ties loosened, voices hoarse. It's the hour when the city exhales, when people stop pretending. Minjun didn't pretend either. He sat in the back corner of a 24-hour convenience store on a Tuesday night, same spot he'd claimed for the past 3 weeks. Black coffee, no sugar, a pack of cigarettes he never opened, just turned over in his hands like a rosary. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, cheap, relentless, the kind of light that makes everything look a little sick. He liked it here because no one bothered him. The part-timer at the counter, some college kid with acne scars and dead eyes, had learned fast. You don't ask questions, you don't make small talk. You let the man in the expensive coat sit in the plastic chair by the instant ramen aisle, and you mind your business. Minjun wasn't old, 34, maybe 35, but he had the face of someone who'd stopped counting birthdays. Sharp jawline, dark eyes that didn't blink much, the kind of handsome that makes people uncomfortable because it comes with something else underneath, something that doesn't smile right. He had a scar, thin, pale, just above his left eyebrow. You wouldn't notice it unless you were looking, but if you were looking that close, you'd already made a mistake. Here's the thing about Minjun. People feared him. Not because he was loud, not because he threatened. He barely spoke, actually. But when he did, things happened. Businesses changed hands. People disappeared from neighborhoods. Debts got paid in ways that didn't involve money. He ran parts of Seoul most people didn't talk about, the kind of empire that doesn't have a name, doesn't have an office, just phones that rang at odd hours, just men in black cars who showed up when you didn't pay attention the first time. But tonight? Tonight he was just tired. He sipped his coffee. It was burnt. It was always burnt. He drank it anyway. The door chimed. Minjun didn't look up. He never did. You learn quick in his line of work, eye contact is a contract, a challenge, an invitation. Better to stay invisible even when everyone knows exactly who you are. But then he heard her voice. "Excuse me, do you have any plasters? Band-aids?" English, accented, soft but firm, like she was used to asking for things she needed and not getting them. The part-timer mumbled something in broken English, pointed vaguely toward the back. Minjun glanced up. She stood by the counter, pulling coins from a small fabric purse, counting them twice. Mid-20s, maybe. Dark skin that caught the fluorescent light in a way that made it look warmer than it was. Her hair pulled back in a bun, a few curls escaping. Nursing scrubs. Blue, wrinkled, with a name tag clipped crooked on her chest. Christiana. She wasn't Korean, that much was obvious. South African, maybe East African, somewhere far from here. Her hands shook a little as she counted the coins, not from cold, from exhaustion. Minjun watched her the way you watch something out of place, not suspicious, just aware. She bought the Band-Aids, a triangle kimbap, a small carton of banana milk. Then she sat down. Not near him, 3 tables over, but still, she sat. Most people didn't sit in convenience stores at 2 a.m. unless they had nowhere else to go. She peeled open the kimbap with care, like it mattered, like it wasn't just cheap rice and pickled radish. She ate slowly, deliberately, the kind of slow that comes from needing the food to last. Minjun looked away. None of his business. But then she opened the Band-Aids and tried to wrap one on her own heel, twisting her ankle awkwardly, wincing as she pressed the adhesive down. It didn't stick right. She tried again. Failed. Her shoulders sagged. Minjun didn't move. He told himself he didn't care, but his jaw tightened. The part-timer's phone buzzed. The kid glanced at it, then slipped into the back room, probably to scroll TikTok for 10 minutes. And in that moment, the hum of the fridge, the distant sound of a taxi horn outside, the woman sighing as she gave up on the Band-Aid, something shifted. Minjun stood. He didn't think about it, didn't plan it, just moved. He walked past her table, grabbed a small bottle of antiseptic spray from the shelf, and set it down for her, without a word. She looked up, startled. Their eyes met. If you're listening right now, here's to remind you that we care about you and your support is much appreciated. Remember how we agreed to help me prove my mother wrong? She said nobody cares about stories where love and survival thrives through difficult situations. If any part of this made you think about the times you had to love or pay sacrifices that cost you, then subscribe. We're building a community that cares about you. Comment where you're watching from. Share this with someone who needs to remember that broken doesn't mean destroyed. Back to our story. Hers were brown, deep, the kind of brown that held something. Grief, maybe, or hope that had been beaten down so many times it didn't know how to stand up anymore. She blinked. "Thank you," she said quietly. Her voice had an ache in it. Minjun nodded once, stepped back, returned to his seat. He didn't look at her again, but he felt her looking at him. And for the first time in years, Minjun felt something he didn't have a name for. Not attraction, not pity. Something worse. Curiosity. She came back the next night, same time, same scrubs, same quiet exhaustion. She didn't sit near him, didn't acknowledge him, just bought her kimbap, her banana milk, and sat by the window. But this time, she didn't struggle with the Band-Aid. She'd already put it on before she came in. Minjun noticed. He hated that he noticed. On the third night, she smiled at him. Just a flicker, a polite acknowledgement. He didn't smile back, but he didn't look away either. And that was the first crack. Because men like Minjun don't look. They don't notice tired nurses counting coins. They don't care about women who eat alone at 2 a.m. But he did. And somewhere, in a part of his chest he thought he'd buried years ago, something very small and very dangerous began to wake up. By the second week, Minjun knew her schedule better than he knew his own, and that should have been the warning sign, but he ignored it, the way you ignore a check engine light when the car still runs. She worked nights at Asan Medical Center. He'd seen the hospital logo on her badge one evening when she'd leaned over to pick up dropped coins, and the laminated card had swung forward, catching the light. She finished her shift at midnight, took the subway to Gangnam Station, walked 14 minutes to this specific convenience store, and stayed for exactly 30 minutes before disappearing into the maze of side streets that led to the older apartment complexes, where rent was cheap and landlords didn't ask questions. He didn't follow her. He didn't need to. He just noticed things, and noticing was something Minjun had spent 20 decades perfecting, because in his world, noticing meant surviving, and not noticing meant a shallow grave in Namyangju where the soil was soft and the questions were few. What he noticed about Christiana was this. She was running from something, but she was also running toward something, and those two opposing forces created a tension in her that reminded him of a wire pulled so tight it hummed. On Tuesday, she came in with a bruise on her forearm, pale purple the size of a thumbprint, and when the part-timer asked if she was okay, she said she'd bumped into a gurney at work, but her eyes went somewhere else when she said it, somewhere dark and far away. Minjun's hands had tightened around his coffee cup, and he'd had to remind himself that other people's problems were not his business, and getting involved in things that didn't concern him was how men in his position ended up dead, or worse, emotional. On Wednesday, she received a phone call that made her whole body go rigid, and she stepped outside to take it. But he could see her through the window, pacing, one hand pressed against her forehead like she was physically holding herself together. And when she came back inside, her eyes were red but dry, like she'd cried all the tears she had years ago and now just went through the motions of grief without the release. On Thursday, she didn't come at all, and Minjun had stayed until 3 a.m., drinking burnt coffee and pretending he wasn't waiting, and the part-timer had given him a look. Not judgmental, just knowing, and Minjun had left feeling something he hadn't felt since he was 17 and stupid. Disappointment. Friday, she returned, and she looked worse, exhausted in a way that goes beyond missed sleep, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying weight that isn't yours, but you can't put down because if you do, someone else suffers. She bought her usual kimbap and banana milk, but this time she also bought a phone card, the international kind, and she stared at it for a long moment before tucking it into her purse like it was something shameful. Minjin had made a decision then, and it was a stupid decision, the kind of men like Minjin didn't survive by making, but he made it anyway. He spoke. Long shift? His voice came out rougher than he'd intended, rusty from disuse, because Minjin didn't do small talk, didn't do casual conversation, and the words felt foreign in his mouth, like a language he'd once known but forgotten how to pronounce. Christiana looked up, surprised, and for a moment he thought she might ignore him, might gather her things and leave, might recognize him for what he was, dangerous. But instead, she did something unexpected. She laughed. Not a full laugh, just a breath of one, tired and real. "You could say that," she replied, and her English was smooth, each word carefully shaped, and he realized she probably spoke several languages, but chose English because it was the only one they might share. Minjin nodded, and the silence that followed should have been awkward, but somehow wasn't, and she sat down at her usual table and he stayed at his, and for 10 minutes they existed in the same space without speaking, and it felt like something. He didn't know what, but something. The next night, Saturday, she came in earlier, 11:47 p.m., and her scrubs were different. Green instead of blue, and there was a coffee stain on the hem that she kept trying to rub out with her thumb, a nervous habit that told him she cared about appearances even when she was falling apart. This time, when she sat down, she was closer, 2 tables away instead of 3, and Minjun wondered if it was intentional or if he was reading patterns into randomness the way paranoid men do when they've spent too long looking over their shoulders. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked. And her tone was light, but her eyes were serious, and he realized she'd been noticing him too, tracking his presence the way he'd been tracking hers, and that realization did something to his chest, something warm and uncomfortable. "Not much," he said, which was true, and also a lie, because he slept fine most nights, but lately he'd been coming here instead, trading rest for routine, and he didn't want to examine why. "Me neither," she said, and she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes, and he saw the exhaustion there, the kind that lived in bone marrow and didn't leave even when you rested. She opened her kimbap, and he watched her eat, small bites, slow chewing, making it last, and he thought about the phone card, the international calls, the bruise, the tears she didn't cry, and a picture began forming in his mind, incomplete, but troubling. "You send money home?" he asked, and it was too personal, too direct, but he'd never learned how to dance around questions, had only learned how to ask them and deal with the consequences. She paused mid-bite, and something flickered across her face. Fear, maybe, or caution, but then it passed, and she nodded. "My daughter," she said quietly. "She's with my mother in Cape Town." And there it was, the weight she carried. The reason for the exhaustion, the cheap meals, the international phone cards, the way she counted coins twice. She had a child on another continent, and she was here, alone, working herself to dust to send money back, and Minjun understood sacrifice in theory, but had never understood it in practice because he'd never had anything worth sacrificing for. "How old?" he asked. "5," Christiana said, and her voice cracked just slightly on the word, and she cleared her throat. "Her name is Tandi. It means beloved." Minjun didn't respond because he didn't trust his voice, didn't trust the strange ache that had opened up behind his ribs, and he looked down at his coffee instead, at the dark surface reflecting the fluorescent lights, and thought about how quickly things could change, how one conversation could crack open a door you didn't know was closed. "I haven't seen her in 8 months," Christiana continued, and she wasn't looking at him anymore, but at the window, at her own reflection in the glass, and her eyes were wet, but still tearless. "I send everything I can. It's never enough. My mother is sick, diabetes, and the medication is expensive, and Tandi needs school fees. And I thought if I came here, worked for a year, maybe 2, I could save enough to go back and actually stay." She laughed again, that same tired breath. But everything costs more than I expected, and the agency that brought me here took most of my first 3 months' salary for fees, and now I'm just stuck. Minjun's jaw tightened, and he felt something old and familiar rising in his chest. Anger, but it was different this time. Not the cold, calculated anger he used like a tool, but something hotter, more personal, and he realized with uncomfortable clarity that he wanted to hurt whoever had taken advantage of her, wanted to find the agency and make them understand what happened to people who exploited the desperate. But he said none of that. Instead, he said, "That's a long time to be away from home." "Yes," she whispered, "it is." And the silence that followed was heavy with things unsaid, with the weight of oceans between mothers and daughters, with the cruel math of survival that forced people to choose between being present and being providers. And Minjun felt something shift in him, some internal geography rearranging itself. This woman, this stranger, was carving space inside him without permission, and he should have been afraid of that, should have recognized the danger. But all he felt was a pull, gravity, the sense that he was standing at the edge of something, and the ground beneath him was already giving way. "You come here every night," Christiana said, and it wasn't a question, but an observation, and her eyes were on him now, direct and searching. "Are you running from something too?" And Minjun, who hadn't answered a personal question honestly in 15 years, who had built his entire existence on silence and strategic deception, found himself saying, "Maybe." Just that, one word. But it was the truth, and she heard it, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. The way ghosts recognize each other in the dark. And Minjun knew, sitting in that fluorescent-lit convenience store at midnight, that he'd just made a mistake. Not because she was dangerous, but because she wasn't, and that was so much worse. The first time Minjun gave her money, he told himself it was practical, not personal, just a transaction between two people who happened to occupy the same corner of Seoul at ungodly hours, and if he happened to slip an envelope with 2 million won into her bag when she went to the bathroom, that was just him being efficient because watching her count coins was starting to irritate him in a way he couldn't articulate. She'd found it later, he knew, because she'd come back the next night and stood in front of his table with the envelope in her trembling hands and her eyes blazing with something between gratitude and fury. And she'd said, "I can't accept this." But her voice had broken on the word can't, and he'd known she would. She had to, because pride doesn't pay for insulin or school fees or plane tickets home. "Then consider it a loan," he'd said. Not looking at her, because looking made it real, made it mean something, and he'd learned long ago that meaning was dangerous in his line of work. "I'll never be able to pay you back," she'd whispered, and the shame in her voice had cut him somewhere he didn't know he could still bleed. "I didn't ask you to," he'd replied, and that had been the end of the conversation. Except it wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something neither of them knew how to name. After that, the nights at the convenience store became something else. Not friendship exactly, but not strangers either. Something in between that felt like standing in a doorway, 1 foot in safety and 1 foot in freefall. And Minjun had spent his whole life calculating risk, but this was a risk his spreadsheets couldn't account for. She started staying longer, 40 minutes instead of 30, then an hour. And they talked about small things. Her daughter's favorite color, yellow. His mother's cooking. Terrible, but he'd never told her. The way Seoul felt foreign to both of them, even though he'd lived here his whole life and she'd been here less than a year. And somewhere in those conversations, Minjun began to feel like a person instead of a position, like someone with a name instead of just a reputation. But the world he'd built didn't stop turning just because he wanted it to, and on a Wednesday in late October, his phone rang at 1:43 a.m., right in the middle of Christiana telling him about the patient who'd grabbed her wrist and called her a slur she wouldn't repeat, and he'd seen the name on the screen, Daijung, his second in command, and known immediately that something had shifted, something had broken, because Daijung never called unless blood had been spilled or was about to be. He'd stepped outside to take it, and Christiana had watched him go with those two knowing eyes, and when he'd returned 15 minutes later, his hands had been shaking, and she'd noticed, had reached across the table and touched his wrist and said, "Are you okay?" And he'd wanted to laugh because, no, he wasn't okay. He'd just learned that Park Jin-woo from the Incheon crew had made a move on Minjun's territory in Itaewon, and 3 of his men were in the hospital and 1 was in the morgue. And now Minjun had to decide whether to escalate or show weakness, and both options led to violence. And he was so tired of violence, so tired of being the man who made those decisions. But he couldn't tell her that. Couldn't explain that the reason he sat in convenience stores at 2 a.m. was because it was the only place he felt human, the only place where people didn't flinch when he entered a room, and she was the only person in years who'd looked at him without fear or calculation, just curiosity and something that might have been kindness. So instead, he'd said, "I'm fine," and pulled his wrist away from her touch because her skin on his felt like evidence, like something that could be used against him. And he'd seen the hurt flash across her face before she'd hidden it, had watched her gather her things and leave earlier than usual, and he'd sat alone in the fluorescent light, hating himself in languages he didn't know he spoke. The retaliation happened 3 days later. Quick, surgical, the kind of operation Minjun had orchestrated 100 times before, and Jinwoo's second-in-command ended up at the bottom of the Han River wearing concrete shoes, like this was a bad movie, except it wasn't a movie. It was Minjun's life, and the weight of it was starting to feel unbearable. Christiana stopped coming to the convenience store, and Minjun told himself it was better this way, cleaner, safer for both of them. But on the 5th night of her absence, he'd found himself standing outside Asan Medical Center at shift change, watching the nurses stream out in their scrubs, searching for her face in the crowd like a teenager with a crush. And when he'd finally spotted her, his chest had done something painful and necessary, like a bone setting after a break. She'd found him too, had stopped walking, and the look on her face had been complicated. Surprise, wariness, something else he couldn't read. And he'd crossed the street without thinking about the traffic or the consequences, just moving towards her, like gravity, like inevitability. "You disappeared," he'd said. And it came out wrong, almost accusatory, when what he'd meant was, "I missed you." But he didn't know how to say things like that, didn't have the vocabulary for tenderness. "I thought it was better," she'd replied, and her voice had been careful, measured, the way you speak to something wild that might bolt or bite. "You seemed troubled, and I don't want to be someone's problem." "You're not a problem," he'd said, too quickly, too honest, and he'd seen her eyes widen slightly because honesty from him was rare, was valuable, was dangerous. "Then what am I?" she'd asked. And it wasn't rhetorical, it was real, and Minjun had realized he was standing at a crossroads that had nothing to do with territory or power or revenge, and everything to do with whether he was brave enough to be something other than what he'd always been. "I don't know," he'd admitted, and it was the most honest thing he'd said in years, "but I'd like to find out." She'd studied his face for a long moment, and he'd had let her see whatever she needed to see, the scar above his eyebrow, the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his jaw was perpetually tight from grinding his teeth in his sleep, all the small violences he carried in his body. And finally, she'd nodded, just once, and said, "Okay." And it was such a small word, but it felt enormous, felt like a door opening onto something he'd thought was closed forever. They'd started meeting outside the convenience store after that, late-night walks along the Cheonggyecheon stream, quiet dinners at 24-hour restaurants where nobody asked questions, moments stolen from their respective lives that felt both sacred and illicit. And Minjun had begun to understand what it meant to be known, truly known, by another person, and it terrified him, because everything he'd ever loved had been taken or destroyed, and Christiana was starting to feel dangerously close to love. But love in Minjun's world was a weapon, and on a cold November evening when he'd walked her back to her apartment building and kissed her for the first time, soft, tentative, like he was afraid she might break, or he might, he'd seen the black sedan parked across the street, had recognized the license plate, had known with sinking certainty that someone was watching, someone was keeping track, and the thing he'd been most afraid of was already happening. He was being seen caring about something, and in his world, caring was the same as bleeding, and bleeding drew sharks. That night, he'd called Daejung and said, "We have a problem." And Daejung had said, "I know, I've been trying to tell you. People are talking. They're saying you're distracted, soft, and Jinwoo's crew is regrouping, and the Russians are making noise about the shipment last month. And boss, I'm telling you this as someone who's been with you since the beginning. Whatever this is with the nurse, it needs to stop before it gets her killed, before it gets you killed." And Minjun had hung up without responding because he didn't have a response, didn't have a plan, didn't have anything except the memory of Christiana's lips against his and the knowledge that he was about to lose something he'd just found. And the cruelty of that timing felt personal, felt like the universe was punishing him for daring to want something gentle in a life built on sharpness. He didn't go to the convenience store that night, or the next, tried to create distance, tried to protect her the only way he knew how, through absence. But on the third night, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and when he'd opened it, his blood had gone cold, because it was a photo of Christiana leaving the hospital, and the message below it read, "She's pretty, be a shame if something happened to her." And Minjun had known, sitting in his empty apartment with his hands shaking and his chest tight, that running from this wouldn't work, that the only way to protect her was to end it completely or claim it fully, and both options felt like losing, and he'd spent his whole life winning, but this wasn't a game he knew how to play. So he made a choice, the kind of choice that changes everything, and he texted Christiana, "We need to talk, tomorrow, it's important." And she replied, "Okay, I'll be at the store at midnight." And Minjun had stared at that message for an hour, knowing that what he was about to do would either save her or destroy them both, and there was no way to know which until it was too late. Minjun arrived at the convenience store at 11:47 p.m., earlier than necessary, and he'd spent those 13 minutes watching the door and rehearsing conversations in his head that all ended badly. And when Christiana finally walked in at exactly midnight, her face was different, guarded, prepared for pain, and he realized she'd been rehearsing too, had been bracing herself for rejection, and the fact that she'd come anyway, knowing it might hurt, told him something about her courage that made this harder. She sat down across from him without buying anything first, breaking her ritual, and that small deviation felt ominous, felt like the world tilting slightly off its axis. And Minjun had his hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold an hour ago, and he couldn't quite make himself meet her eyes.
"I need to tell you something," he said, and his voice was steadier than he felt. Years of practice of projecting control even when everything inside was chaos. "And after I tell you, you're going to want to leave, and I won't stop you, but I need you to understand why we can't—" He stopped, tangled in syntax and fear, and Christiana reached across the table and took his hand, actually took it, wrapped her warm fingers around his cold ones, and said, "Just tell me the truth. Whatever it is, I can handle the truth." And Minyoon almost laughed because, no, she couldn't. Nobody could handle his truth. But she was looking at him with such steady certainty that he found himself believing she might be the exception. "I'm not a good man," he began, and she started to interrupt, but he raised his free hand, kept going. "I don't mean that in the abstract way people say it when they've made mistakes or hurt feelings. I mean it literally. I run criminal operations in Seoul, gambling, protection, imports that don't go through customs, and I've hurt people, Christiana. I've done things that would make you sick if you knew the details. And the only reason I'm telling you this is because someone knows about you now. Someone took your picture, and being near me has made you a target." The words came out flat, clinical, like he was delivering a medical diagnosis, and he watched her face carefully, cataloging each micro-expression: surprise, confusion, fear, and then something unexpected. She didn't pull her hand away. "I know," she said quietly, and it was Minyoon's turn to be surprised, and she must have seen it on his face because she continued, I mean, I didn't know specifics, but I'm not stupid, Min-yoon. I've seen the way people look at you, the way the convenience store clerk practically holds his breath when you're here, the expensive watch you wear with the cheap coffee, the scars, the phone calls you take outside that make you come back looking like you've seen ghosts. I knew you were something, someone, I just didn't know what. And you stayed anyway? He asked, and he genuinely didn't understand, couldn't compute why anyone would knowingly walk toward danger. And she smiled, but it was sad, weighted with knowledge he didn't have yet. We all have things we're running from, she said, and there was something in her tone that made the hair on his neck stand up, some hint that this conversation was about to become more complicated than he'd planned. And sometimes the dangerous thing feels safer than the safe thing. Do you understand what I'm saying? No, Min-yoon admitted, and Christiana took a breath like she was about to jump off something high, and when she spoke, her voice was smaller, younger, scraped raw. The bruise you saw on my arm 3 weeks ago, that wasn't from a gurney at work, that was from my ex, Thondi's father. His name is Sizwe, and he's found out I was in Seoul, and he's been calling, demanding I send money, threatening to take Thondi away from my mother if I don't pay him what he says I owe. And the debt keeps growing, keeps changing, and I don't know how to make it stop except to disappear completely. But I can't disappear because my daughter needs me, needs the money I send, and I'm trapped in this loop of trying to save her by staying away, which is killing me, which is maybe what he wants. I don't know anymore. The words tumbled out like they'd been dammed up for months, and Min-yoon felt them hit him in waves, her own danger, her own secrets, the realization that she'd been carrying threats just as heavy as his. And suddenly the dynamic shifted, tilted, became something more equal and more complicated, because he'd come here to push her away for her protection, and she'd just revealed she'd been protecting herself all along, or trying to. How much does he want? Min-yoon asked, and it was the wrong question but the only one his brain could formulate, his default setting of solving problems with money or force. And Christiana laughed, bitter. Last week it was $5,000, this week it's $8,000, next week it'll be $10. It's not about the amount, it's about control. It's about making sure I never get free. And I thought... She stopped, swallowed hard. I thought I'd come here, put an ocean between us, he'd forget about me. But men like Sizwe don't forget. They just find new ways to hurt you from a distance. Men like Sizwe, Min-yoon repeated slowly, and something cold was forming in his chest, something calculated and familiar. Do they make threats they can't make through on, or is your mother actually in danger? Christiana's eyes went wet, and she pulled her hand back, wrapped both arms around herself like she was suddenly cold, and nodded. He showed up at her house last month, told her he had rights as Thondi's father, said if I didn't start sending more money he'd take custody, and in South Africa, in the courts there, he might actually win, because I'm not there, because I abandoned them, that's what his lawyer would say, and my mother can't fight him, she's too sick, too tired, and Thondi is 5 years old and doesn't understand why her mother left, and I'm here in Seoul counting coins for kimbap while my baby girl thinks I don't love her enough to stay.
She was crying now, quiet tears that tracked down her face and dripped onto the plastic table, and Min-joon felt something break open inside him, some compartment he'd kept sealed for self-preservation, and he understood with painful clarity that this woman had looked at his darkness and chosen to sit beside it because she had her own darkness and thought maybe together they could make something less lonely, less heavy. And he'd been so focused on protecting her from his world, he hadn't considered she might need protecting from her own. I can make this go away, he said, and his voice had changed, had gone flat and cold, the tone he used when making decisions that involved blood and consequences. One phone call to the right people in Johannesburg and Sizwe stops being a problem permanently, and your daughter is safe, your mother is safe, you're safe. Christiana looked up sharply and her face was horrified, and she said, "No, absolutely not. I'm not asking you to, Minjun, I'm not asking you to kill someone for me. That's not why I told you. I just wanted you to understand that I know what it means to be trapped by violence, to have the people you love used as leverage. And I'm not judging you for what you do because I'm not in a position to judge anyone." "Then what are you asking for?" Minjun demanded, and he was frustrated because he knew how to solve problems with force, with money, with fear, but she was asking for something he didn't know how to give: understanding without action, witness without intervention, and it felt impossible, felt like watching someone drown and being told not to jump in. "I'm asking you to let me choose," she said, and her voice was steady again, stronger. "I'm asking you to stop trying to protect me by pushing me away, because I've been pushed away my whole life, by my father who left when I was 6, by Sizwe who only wanted me when I was useful, by circumstances that forced me to choose between being a mother and being a provider. And I'm tired of people making decisions about what's best for me without asking what I actually want." "And what do you want?" Minjun asked, and he was genuinely asking, not rhetorically, because her answer would determine everything that came next. "I want to be seen," Christiana whispered, and it was such a simple request, but it landed like a bomb. "I want someone to know all of me, the parts that are afraid, the parts that are broken, the parts that had to leave their daughter behind and live with that guilt every single day, and not run away, not try to fix it, just stay." Minjun looked at her, really looked, and saw a woman who'd crossed an ocean to save a child she couldn't hold, who'd worked herself to exhaustion to send money to people who depended on her, who'd let herself care about a criminal in a convenience store because maybe his brokenness matched hers. And he thought about all the ways he'd failed people in his life, all the relationships he'd burned or buried to maintain power, and he wondered if he was capable of being what she needed, or if he'd just end up being another man who hurt her in the name of protection. "I need to think," he said, finally, and it wasn't rejection, but it wasn't acceptance either, just honesty. Because if we do this, if we really do this, it changes everything, for both of us, and there are people in my world who will see you as weakness, who will use you to get to me, and I need to figure out how to keep you safe without losing you, if that's even possible. Christiana nodded, and she stood up, gathered her things, but before she left, she leaned down and kissed him on the forehead, gentle, deliberate, and said, "Take your time, but know that I've already decided. I've been deciding for weeks, and waiting for you to catch up is okay, but don't wait too long, because men like Sizwe and men like whoever took that photo of me, they don't wait. They just take what they want." And then she was gone, and Minjun sat alone in the fluorescent light with the ghost of her lips on his skin and the weight of impossible choices pressing down on his chest. And he pulled out his phone and stared at Daizheng's number for a long time before finally typing, "I need options. Protection detail, surveillance on a South African national named Sizwe, surname unknown, and background checks on the Golden Lion Employment Agency, and I need it quiet." The response came 30 seconds later. "Boss, this is a mistake." Minjun typed back, "I know. Do it anyway." Because here's what he'd realized sitting in that convenience store at 1 a.m. with his coffee long cold and his heart doing uncomfortable things in his chest. He'd spent his entire adult life avoiding exactly this kind of complication, this kind of vulnerability, and it made him powerful and lonely and hollow. And maybe being seen by someone who understood darkness was worth the risk of being destroyed by it. Or maybe he was just tired of being alone. Either way, he'd already made his choice the moment he'd put that money in her bag, the moment he'd asked about her daughter, the moment he'd let him touch his wrist and hadn't pulled away. He just hadn't admitted it until now. His phone buzzed again, but it wasn't Dae-jung this time. It was the unknown number from before, and the message made his blood go cold. "She told you about Sizwe, didn't she? Interesting. Makes this more complicated, or maybe easier. We'll be in touch." And Minjun understood then that he wasn't the only one watching, wasn't the only one with leverage, and whatever was coming next was bigger than a territorial dispute with Jinwoo's crew, bigger than protection money and shipping routes. This was personal, targeted, and someone had done their homework, had known exactly which thread to pull to make his whole world unravel. He stood up, threw money on the table, and walked out into the Seoul night with his jaw tight and his mind racing, and somewhere in the dark a storm was gathering, and he was standing right in its path. And for the first time in his life, Minjun wasn't sure if he'd survive it. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he wouldn't survive it alone. The call came at 4:17 a.m. on a Thursday, and Minjun knew before he answered that everything had already changed. And when he heard Christiana's voice on the other end, small, shaking, wrong, his entire body went cold. "Minjun," she whispered, and there was traffic noise in the background, wind, the sound of her breathing too fast. "I'm sorry, I didn't know who else to call. They took my phone. I can't go to the police. I can't—" Her voice broke, reformed. "Thondi is gone." The world tilted, and Minjun was already moving, pulling on clothes, grabbing his keys, his phone pressed to his ear so hard it hurt, and he was saying, "Where are you? Tell me exactly where you are." And she was trying to answer, but the words came out fractured, and finally he heard Hongdae, the park near the Children's Museum. "Stay there," he commanded, and his voice was flat and certain, even though nothing inside him felt certain. "Don't move, don't talk to anyone, I'm coming now." He found her 23 minutes later hunched on a park bench with her arms wrapped around herself and her scrubs torn at the shoulder, and when she saw him, she stumbled toward him and he caught her, actually caught her like a body falling, and she pressed her face into his chest and said things he couldn't understand, Korean and English and what might have been Hausa all mixed together, and he just held her and let her shake. Eventually, the words started making sense, started forming a narrative, and Minjun pieced it together while his blood turned to ice, and his mind cataloged names and targets and all the ways he was going to dismantle whoever had done this. Sizwe had taken Thondi from Christiana's mother with legal papers and police who didn't ask enough questions, had brought her to Seoul, had sent Christiana a video of the child crying, and when Christiana went to the hotel address they'd given her, Sizwe wasn't alone. There were 2 Korean men who knew Minjun's name, who said Thondi would be returned when Minjun paid 15 million won, who grabbed Christiana's shoulder when she said she wouldn't ask him to pay, who told her she was merchandise and Minjun was the buyer. "I ran," Christiana said, hollow, "because I'm not the prize, she is. She's the leverage, and I don't know what to do. I can't think." "Stop," Minjun said, pulling back to look at her face. "Breathe. Look at me. We're going to get her back, I promise you." "You can't promise that," Christiana whispered, and there was something broken in her voice. "They could hurt her." "They won't," Minjun interrupted, and his certainty was absolute because he understood the game being played, understood that Thondi was worth alive than dead. But even as he thought it, he knew he was gambling with someone else's daughter, and if he was wrong, he couldn't be wrong. "I need to make calls," he said, already pulling out his phone, "and you need to come with me. You're not safe here, you're not safe anywhere until this is finished." "I don't want you to kill anyone," Christiana said suddenly, urgently, grabbing his wrist. "Minjun, please, I don't want Thondi to get her mother back only to lose you to prison or worse. There has to be another way." And Minjun looked at this exhausted, terrified, brave woman who was asking a criminal to show mercy to the people who'd kidnapped her child, and he felt something crack inside him, some hardness he had maintained for years. "I'll pay them," he said finally, and it physically hurt to say it, hurt his pride, his reputation, everything he'd built on never showing weakness. "I'll pay the money, we'll arrange an exchange, and if they keep their word, if they give her back unharmed, then no one has to die." "And if they don't keep their word?" asked Christiana, already knowing the answer. "Then I become what I've always been," Minjun said quietly, "and you decide whether you can live with that." The exchange was set for Friday night, 31 hours away, and Minjun spent that time preparing for the official exchange and preparing for it to go wrong, because deals made under duress rarely ended cleanly. Dae-jung argued that paying made Minjun look weak, that Jinwoo's crew would smell blood and escalate, but Minjun had overruled him, had looked at Christiana sleeping on his couch, the first time anyone had slept in his apartment besides him in 5 years, and thought, "Let me be weak, just this once. Let me choose something soft over something sharp." The warehouse in Incheon was neutral territory, abandoned enough for privacy, and Minjun arrived with Daejung carrying 15 million won in cash, and Christiana was in a car 2 blocks away with instructions to drive to the police if she didn't hear from him within the hour. Jinwoo's men arrived 10 minutes late, 4 of them, including Sizwe, who held Thondi's hand, this tiny girl with braided hair and Christiana's eyes, confused and scared and too young to understand the adult nightmare she'd been pulled into. "The money first," Kang said, a mid-level enforcer Minjun recognized, and Minjun set the briefcase down, opened it, showed the cash. "Count it if you want," Minjun said. "It's all there." During the count, Minjun watched Thondi, watched her looking at the door like she was hoping her mother would appear, and he thought about all the children who'd suffered because of decisions men like him made, and he felt the weight of it, really felt it, in a way he'd been avoiding for years. "It's good," the counter confirmed, and Kang smiled, and Minjun knew in his bones that they weren't going to honor the deal, that this had always been about humiliation, and he was already moving when Kang reached for his gun, already shouting, "Down!" already calculating how to get to Thondi before the bullets started. The shot went wild, and then everything was chaos, and Minjun was running toward Thondi while Daejung returned fire, and Sizwe was pulling the girl backward, using her as a shield, and Minjun tackled him low and hard, heard the man's head crack against concrete, and then Thondi was in his arms, and he was rolling behind pallets while bullets pinged off metal. It lasted 90 seconds, and when it was over, 2 of Jinwoo's men were down, and Kang was running, and Sizwe was unconscious and bleeding, and Minjun was crouched behind pallets with a 5-year-old crying in his arms, and he didn't know what to say, so he just held her and repeated, "It's okay, your mom is coming, your mom is coming," like a prayer. Christiana arrived before the police, and when she saw Thondi, she made a sound beyond words, and she was running and crying and taking her daughter from him, and Thondi was saying, "Mama, Mama," and clutching at her, and Minjun stood there with blood on his shirt, watching them, and Daejung said quietly, "We need to go, now." But Minjun didn't move, and Christiana looked up at him with tears streaming and said, "Thank you." And Minjun nodded once and turned to leave, because staying meant questions he couldn't answer. "Wait," Christiana called, standing with Thondi wrapped around her. "Where are you going?" "Away," Minjun said. "They'll come for me after this, and being near me now is—" "I don't care," Christiana interrupted, fierce, certain. "I don't care what it means. You just saved my daughter's life. You could have walked away, and you didn't, and I'm not losing you now, not when I just found someone who stayed." And Minjun felt it then, the transformation, the irreversible shift, because he'd spent 34 years building walls, and this woman had walked through them like they were paper, and he had a choice now, between safety and connection, between survival and living. "I can't promise this ends well," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to," Christiana replied. And somewhere in the distance, sirens were starting, and Daejung was pulling at his arm, and Minjun had 90 seconds to decide what kind of man he wanted to be, the kind who disappeared and survived alone, or the kind who stayed and chose love, even when love was the most dangerous choice of all. He stayed. 6 months later, Minjun stood in a garden that didn't exist before, and he was planting tomatoes with hands that used to break bones, and the absurdity of it wasn't lost on him, but he stopped questioning absurdity around the time Thondi started calling him Uncle Jun and climbing onto his shoulders like he was safe, like he was home. It was different now. Christiana's nursing textbooks on the coffee table, Thandi's drawings magneted to the refrigerator, the smell of something cooking that wasn't instant ramen, sounds of life where there used to be only silence. And some mornings Minjun woke up and didn't recognize his own life, couldn't reconcile the man who'd put 2 bullets in Kang's men with the man who now read bedtime stories about talking animals and made funny voices that made a 5-year-old giggle. He'd stepped back from operations, not completely. You don't just leave his world, you renegotiate your place in it. But enough that Daejong ran most things now. Enough that Minjun's phone didn't ring at 3 a.m. with problems that required violence to solve, and Jinwoo's crew had dissolved after their failed play, scattered to other cities or other industries, and the territory was quiet in a way that felt temporary, like weather before a storm. Some nights he still couldn't sleep, still saw Sizway's head cracking against concrete, still heard the sound Thandie had made when the gunfire started, and Christiana would find him on the balcony at 2 a.m., and she wouldn't ask questions, would just stand beside him in the dark, and her presence was enough, was everything, was the only thing keeping him tethered to this new version of himself that felt both real and impossibly fragile. "You're thinking too loud," Christiana said now, coming out to the garden with iced tea, and Thandie was at her hip, always at her hip, making up for 8 months of separation by refusing to be more than 3 feet away from her mother. "Just thinking," Mingyan replied, and he took the tea, and their fingers brushed, and even after 6 months, that small touch still did something to his chest, still felt like proof that this was real, that he hadn't imagined tenderness back into his life. "About?" she asked, sitting on the garden bench he'd built last month, pulling Thandie onto her lap. "Whether I deserve this," he said honestly, because they'd agreed early on, no lies, no pretending, just brutal honesty even when it hurt. And Christiana's face softened, but she didn't rush to reassure him, didn't offer empty comfort. "I don't know if deserve is the right word," she said slowly, thoughtfully. "I think maybe we both just needed it, and sometimes need is enough. Sometimes surviving means accepting good things, even when you're not sure you've earned them." Thandie wiggled free and ran to Minjun, grabbed his hand with her small, sticky one, and said, "Uncle Jun, can we plant the yellow flowers now?" And he looked down at this child who'd been through trauma but was somehow resilient, somehow still believed the world could be gentle. And he nodded and let her lead him to the corner of the garden they'd designated for marigolds. He didn't know if he was good for them, didn't know if proximity to him would eventually bring the violence he'd tried to leave behind. Didn't know if men like him got to keep soft things, or if soft things were just borrowed, temporary, destined to be taken back by a world that didn't forgive his kind of history. But he was trying to be the man Thandie thought he was, trying to be worthy of the way Christiana looked at him, not with fear or calculation, but with something that might have been love, though neither of them had said the word yet, as if saying it might break the spell. Daejong had called last week, voice tight, said there were rumors that Park Jin-woo was back in Seoul, that he was asking questions, making alliances, and Minjun had felt the old instincts kick in, the need to strike first, to eliminate threats, to protect what was his through force. But then Thandie had shouted, "Uncle Jun, come look at my homework," and he'd put the phone down and chosen her over strategy, chosen presence over preparation. And maybe that made him weak, maybe that would cost him everything, but he'd made his choice. That night, after Thandie was asleep and Christiana was reading in bed, Minjun stood in the doorway of his own life and looked at what he'd built. This woman, this child, this quiet apartment with its tomato plants and refrigerator art, and he thought about all the ways it could shatter, all the threats still circling in the dark, all the debts unpaid and enemies unmade, and he felt the weight of it, the precariousness, the knowledge that peace in his world was always conditional, always temporary. But he also felt something else. Hope. Fragile and dangerous and probably foolish, but hope nonetheless. Christiana looked up from her book, caught him watching, and smiled. Small, private, real, and patted the bed beside her, and Minjun crossed the room and lay down next to her, and she rested her head on his chest, and for a moment everything was quiet. Everything was still. Everything was exactly as it should be. "Do you think it'll last?" she whispered into the dark. "I don't know," Minjun said, and it was the truth. "But I'll fight for it if I have to." "I know you will," she said, and there was sadness in her voice, acceptance of who he was and what that meant. "Just promise me you'll fight smart, not just hard." "I promise," he said, and he meant it, even though he wasn't sure he knew the difference anymore. Outside, Seoul hummed with its endless night noise, and somewhere in that noise, threats were forming, consequences were gathering, the past was coming to collect what it was owed. But in this moment, in this bed, with this woman breathing softly against him, and this child sleeping safely down the hall, Min Jun let himself believe that maybe, he'd found something worth more than survival, something worth becoming someone new for. Even if that someone was still learning how to be gentle, even if the world wouldn't let him keep it. Even if the story wasn't finished, just paused, waiting to see if love could hold against everything he'd been and everything that was coming. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he didn't dream of violence. He dreamed of gardens.